wanted to take a second and welcome everybody. This is the Social Impacts of Transportation. This is a special board meeting that the Transportation Board has wanted to sponsor as part of their 2013 work plan. This is something that's very important to them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. I'm Mark Jackson. I'm the Staff Board Liaison. I'm also the Deputy Director for the city's Planning, Development, and Transportation work area. I've been the Staff Liaison for the Transportation Board for...
Too long.
8 years. Thank you, yes. I told somebody the other day, I think it's a life sentence. So I'm very pleased to be able to bring this panel to you tonight. Before we get started, one of the things we wanted to do was have the Transportation Board introduce themselves and welcome you, and then we'll ask the members of the panel to introduce themselves as well, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do tonight, kind of ground rules, what we're hoping to accomplish and such.
I'm Clint Skutkan. I've been on the board, I think, going on 2.5 years now.
My name is Olga Duval. I'm on the Transportation Board for 5 years already. And I work for the Salvation Army. I'm a social services director, so I'm very interested in this topic.
My name is Pat Jordan. This is my second term to be on the Transportation Board. Glad all of you could come tonight. I'm sorry we didn't have more, but thank you, brave souls, for coming out tonight.
Hi, I'm Mary Atchison. I'm on the Transportation Board as well.
Hi, I'm Gary Steen. Welcome to the Transportation Board for February. This is going to be our unofficial, well, actually our official meeting for the month of February. If you'd like to attend our regular meetings, they are the third Wednesday of every month in this room. So, as Mark mentioned, this is something the board became interested in one of our monthly meetings, is actually exploring the social impacts of transportation. So that's how this format began, and Mark was good enough to gather this panel and put it together. So we'll start.
Great.
Right there.
I thought what we do is have each of the panelists just introduce yourself real quickly, and then we'll kick off a little bit with ground rules.
I'm Mike Devereaux. I'm with the Commission on Disability and also with Barrier Busters Public Transit Action Group. Thank you for inviting me.
Gary Thomas, and I'm the Executive Director of Saint Volunteer Transportation and involved in a number of transportation-type committees.
Barbara Schoenberger. I'm on staff at the Fort Collins Senior Center, and I'm also staff liaison to the Senior Advisory Board.
Hi, I'm Marlo Hingle, and I am a circles leader with Larimer County Circles.
And I'm Emma McArdle with Transport.
We're going to try and keep this to around 2 hours tonight, but it really depends on you and how long you want to stay and talk about this topic. The format for this evening, what we thought we would do is give each of the panelists about 10 to 15 minutes to talk about, from their particular perspective, from either the agencies they represent or their life experiences, what the impacts of transportation are for them, what that means, whether it's access to jobs or medical care or education or just quality of life. What are those issues and some of the concerns and some of the things that they're doing. It's a really good panel. I'm just so grateful to have them here at the table. Before we dive in, Gary had talked a little bit about how the board's interest in the social aspects or the social importance of transportation has evolved over the years. From a professional standpoint, it's been fascinating to watch the evolution, the transformation of the transportation industry. It's really been pretty remarkable. I've been at the city for 13 years, been in this business for going on 20. And when I first started, up until relatively recent history, transportation hasn't been necessarily about people. And I know that sounds a little goofy, but what it's really been focused on is efficiency, throughput, and really more about maximum throughput, if you will. And that really was kind of, if you look at some of the master planning efforts all the way up until 2004, the focus really was on, gosh, what's the ultimate size of street we're going to need, or what's the ultimate bus build out, or how many turn lanes is this going to need to work for this development, those sorts of conversations. And it's only been recent, I would say, since it really has taken hold in Fort Collins with the last city plan transportation master planning effort, where the focus really shifted. It wasn't on what the ultimate build out is. It's about what works best for people. And it's not a one size fits all. My good friend Suzanne has a saying, not everybody wears a size 9 brown shoe. That's what you get for coming in late. And that's really what we're about here today, too. We're talking about different populations have different needs. It's not just for people who own 2.3 automobiles and drive to work every day, park in a parking lot or a parking structure. There's other populations that either can't or choose not to drive a car for a myriad of reasons. And those are the things that we want to talk about. And as a community, we're community values. And that's a whole new conversation, too, in terms of transportation. And I know it sounds like we're just coming out of the dark ages, but that's kind of transportation. And it's really more about what works well from an economic standpoint. How does transportation facilitate the local economy, commerce, movement of products and goods and information? It's about the social aspects. Does everybody have the ability to access transportation to get where they want? Jobs, education, healthcare, things of that nature, and the environmental aspect as well. As we're all talking more about being a green organization, about trying to be more of a green community, and what that means in terms of giving people real viable opportunities to get around town that don't require having to set aside half your day to get there. And that's really, that's a transformational shift in what we're trying to do. So each of these people that we're going to talk with tonight, or have you talk with tonight, come from a different perspective, a different life experience. And I was hoping I had to ask them if they could share a little bit about what their experiences are, what their challenges are, if you will, and then we'll toss it open to the group. Does that sound good? Again, thank you all very, very much. I appreciate you all being here tonight. I hope you enjoy. Mikey, it's yours.
Okay. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Mark Jackson and the Commission on Transportation for inviting me here to be part of the panel discussion this evening. I'm a member of Barrier Busters Public Transit Action Group, otherwise known as BBPTAG. We are a focus group for people with disabilities in Fort Collins, and we're dedicated to bringing effective and sustainable public transit to all the people in Fort Collins. I'm also vice chairman of the commission, and we are a channel of information for the disabled to the Fort Collins City Council. But mostly, I'm a person with a disability living in a great city called Fort Collins. I've been a resident of Fort Collins for over 35 years. I've been involved with the development of our city for a good share of that time. Mostly I've been involved as a civil designer of land development projects, and recently involved as a concerned citizen. That's okay. I'm proud of how our city has grown over the last 3 decades. I believe we're on a cusp of another growth spurt here in Fort Collins. To me, it's great to see earth movers out cutting in new streets and backholes digging trenches and sewer and drainage structures, or for sewer and drainage structures. Eventually, the new growth means a greater need for public transportation. This transportation discussion panel isn't about me, but I'm a good example of the need for public transportation for people with disabilities. If I can, I'd like to describe a typical trip for me on the transport bus system. Last week, I forgot to make my dial-a-ride reservation 24 hours in advance for my Monday appointment at 11. The appointment location was across town from me, but I didn't want to miss my physical therapy. That meant using the transport bus system. I had to leave the house at 9:25, knowing it would take 30 minutes to cut through 3 subdivisions and pass 1 school to reach the closest bus stop. The 3 subdivisions are north of Old Town, near the country club, golf course, Long Pond, and Linden Lake. The school is Tavelli. All of these are north of town, but well within the city limits. Yet none of them are served by transport. My closest bus stop is the corner of North LeMay Avenue and Conifer Street. From there, I took the Route 81 bus to the Downtown Transit Center and transferred to the Route 1 bus and rode it to College and Drake bus stop. From there, I traveled 1 mile by my power chair to Center Avenue and Shield Street, which is where my physical therapy is located. After all that, I was still 10 minutes early for my 11 o'clock appointment. My trip home was similar, except for an hour at Dazbog Coffee Shop, trying to thaw my hands out from the 30-degree temperature last Monday. I made it back home at 3:30. My total time, 9:30 to 3:30, was 6 hours. Can you imagine all that for a 1-hour physical therapy appointment? That is a typical day for someone with a disability and being dependent on transport. With BBP tag and the COD, we have set many goals for transport. Some of the goals are short-term, like getting Sunday service, and long-term items like a grid system with 20-minute intervals on pickups. One goal we're continually working on is the mindset of the people in Fort Collins. There is a stereotype of the bus rider as a person who has no other option for transportation. In some cases, that's true, but there are others who use transport because it is a great alternative to driving your car. BBP tag is trying hard to convince the public that public transportation should be your first option for travel. You're saving money and you're saving the environment. BBP tag has kicked around the idea of having t-shirts printed up saying transport is the first choice, not the last resort. Dial-A-Ride is a vital part of the transport system. Personally, I would be stranded without it. Sadly, when Dial-A-Ride decided to reduce their area of service to ADA standards, anyone beyond 3/4 of a mile of the bus route were cut off from Dial-A-Ride service. Thanks to the BBP tag and vocal citizens, the City Council was convinced to grandfather in those who were currently on Dial-A-Ride's service list. Thank you. Me included, to continue receiving service. My new neighbors bought the handicap accessible unit a couple doors down, but will not be eligible to apply for Dial-A-Ride service. Until Transport establishes a north route to cover subdivisions like Storybook, Adriel Hills, Maple Leaf, Marymount, and the Trevally School, my neighbors won't be able to use Dial-A-Ride. I need to say a few things about working with Transport and their staff. Everyone is professional and friendly. When we approach Transport with ideas and suggestions, we know they're taking into consideration. Even when we have a difference of opinion, we're able to bring our ideas to the table and work them out. Today is an exciting time for Transport and us with the MAX coming online, a project that has been years in the making. I believe I heard Kurt Ravenschlag say he's been on the Mason Street project ever since he came on board with the city. I believe that was back sometime in the 1900s. If I still have time, let me mention a few more things that are on our to-do list. We would like to see the application process for use of Dollaride reworked to something that is less invasive. A lot has been done already. The amount of pages to fill out, needed to be filled out, is still quite intimidating. A regular book. We want to keep our two-way communication open with our liaisons to the city. BBPTAG and COD can't say enough of how much we appreciate our liaisons. We want to continue to be involved in the design stages of changes to the transport system. BBPTAG and the COD will continue to campaign for Sunday service. We will reach out to agencies and businesses to accommodate non-driving employees. BBPTAG and the COD will work with the establishment of a regional transit system. We'll strive to have all routes on a shorter time interval, similar to the Route 1's 20-minute intervals. In conclusion, you've all been waiting for that. BBPTAG wants to be the voice of the people of Fort Collins concerning transportation. And the Commission on Disability will continue to be the ears of the disabled in Fort Collins. Thank you.
Next up, Gary Thomas.
And I have to follow you. Oh, great. Hi, so I'm Gary Thomas. My day job is the director of SAINT, which is an acronym stands for Senior Alternatives in Transportation. We're a volunteer ride service that was formed 30 years ago here in Fort Collins to give rides to seniors, and to us, a senior is anybody over age 60, and individuals with disabilities that prevent them from driving. It's all done with volunteers who drive their own cars. As a result, while we can take canes and walkers, we can't take chairs and scooters because we're in private vehicles that are not equipped to do that. We have about 165 volunteers. We operate in both Fort Collins and Loveland, and we give about 25,000 rides per year. So it's more than just a little back of an envelope thing. It was started 30 years ago by two ladies in the city of Fort Collins. In fact, we were a function of the city office on volunteering for about the first 10 years, who had a notion. And the notion was this: there are people in the community who could continue to live in their homes if they just had access to the goods and services they need. And there's people in the community who would be willing to give them a ride if they just knew each other. And so basically, and ever since, that's what SAINT does. We put together people who want to ride with people who are willing to give one. It's a remarkable service, and I got involved with it, I guess, well, because I was recently retired and looking for something to do, but I had a personal connection. My mother had lived in San Angelo, Texas the last few years of her life, had macular degeneration, lost her ability to drive, no service such as this in there, and I lived in Delaware at the time. And so basically she was homebound for the last 2 years of her life, and she need not be. She was otherwise a healthy individual who just simply had no transportation alternatives. And so when I was looking for something to do and saw the ad for SAINT and knew something about it, I was delighted to have an opportunity to be part of it. We're a volunteer service, and that means we're fairly inexpensive. I'll give you a few numbers just to kind of bat around. If you have Dollaride come out and get you, or Colt Paratransit in Loveland, that's anywhere from $25 to $45 per one-way trip. If you ride with SAINT, it's about $9 per one-way trip by the time we do our insurance and our scheduling and all the stuff we do. If you get on a city bus out there, it's $4 a trip. So we're in that middle range between a very efficient system like the city bus and a very expensive system like the Dollaride system. And that's a niche we can serve. But when you deal with volunteers, and those of you who do this know this already, you don't tell a volunteer what to do, you ask. We don't hire volunteers, we woo them. And there's just a physical limit to how much you can do with volunteers. As a result, over the years, we've constricted our service to our little niche. We have a defined geographic area that we serve. It's not essentially the city limits of Fort Collins, but it's more or less. We operate banker's hours from 8:15 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon, Monday through Friday. And as I indicated, we can't take equipment bigger than walkers and oxygen bottles. But within that niche, there's a whole bunch of people who need transportation and who can continue to live independently if they can just get around. Since I got into this job, I came across an interesting statistic. This was a study that was published in the Journal of Public Health. Americans on average outlive their ability to drive about 10 years. Say that again. Most of us are going to outlive our driving ability by 10 years. Now, of that 10 years, my experience has been the last 2 or 3, you're probably in assisted living and don't really need help. The first year or 2, you haven't totally burned out your friends and your family. But there's a period in there where you could still continue to have a quality of life if you could just get your own transportation arranged without having to either impose on your friends and relatives or do without. Dial-A-Ride and we serve a lot of the same people, but because of the cost factors and because actually we go areas we don't. We serve Mike's neighborhood. Unfortunately, we can't help Mike with his chair, but we actually go that far out where Dial-A-Ride does not. But then again, we're not operating on the weekends, and we can't take people with chairs. If you have the ability to access goods and services, the quality of your life goes way up, but there's a secondary benefit, and it's not one that's immediately obvious. Keeping people in their homes keeps multiple generational neighborhoods going. When most of us were kids growing up, every neighborhood was multi-generational. It just never occurred to us that that would be any other way. But today's sprawled out car-centric communities make it so difficult for seniors to stay in their homes when they get past their ability to drive that we really lose that societal benefit of having all of us there together. And that's kind of neat to be part of an organization that works on that. When you ask people, well, how important is Saint to your independence? One of our riders said this, and I thought it was one of the more profound things I heard. She said, losing my ability to drive was as difficult for me as losing my spouse, because it is the last element of your independence. Think about most of us, when we were growing up and we could finally get that car key and we could go driving, and wow, what a sense of accomplishment and adulthood that was. And that stays with you all the way until suddenly one day you discover you can't. One of the phone calls I get is not from the future client, it's from the kids, people my age, who say, Dad's got to the point he's not safe anymore, we're going to have to take the keys away from him. What do we do? And that has driven home a point with me. Most of us have thought about our financial planning. Most of us have not thought about what's going to happen when we quit driving. Adding to that overall situation is something Barbara and I have been working on, is the so-called senior tsunami. There's 78 million baby boomers. I'm one of the older ones, born in 48. And when we start reaching the point we can no longer drive, we are absolutely going to overwhelm all systems. We'll overwhelm Dial-A-Ride, we'll overwhelm Saint. There simply isn't, and you can't afford to move that many people around on a personal door-to-door kind of process. That led me to become very interested and excited in the Mason Corridor Plan and the concept of transit-oriented development, that you would start building residences around the concept of being available to get on city buses, which today is still the most efficient way to move people about. But the human side of it can never be forgotten. Yeah, that bus going by out there full of people is maybe a sight some people appreciate, maybe some people don't. But everybody on that bus is there for a reason. Very few people ride them for fun. Probably happens. But in the Saint business, every one of our rides, or somebody needs a ride that they needed to go to. And this is an interesting fact, and not so much with the social thing, but it's something that's come up and I've come to appreciate. Every transit trip is an economic event. Money changes hands at one end or the other of that trip. And so as the development community has looked at the Mason Corridor, you see all of a sudden this explosion of housing and things along there. where the economic benefits suddenly became obvious. Yes, if you can build a facility where people can get in there, live there, and travel without having to drive a car everywhere they go, there's a benefit to that. I'll close with one note. I was one of the motormen on the streetcar here for a number of years and did a little bit of research into streetcar history. And as you may know, Fort Collins was one of the smallest towns to have a really good streetcar system. When subdivisions first started to be built in cities and they started to be further out than people could comfortably walk, the developers put in streetcars because that's how they sold their houses. The mobility access of a streetcar, which today of course would be by bus or light rail or something else, was a necessary part of the growth and the development of cities. So one of my hopes, and I'm delighted to see the Transportation Board starting to think along these lines, is as we think about what the future looks like, whether it's the price of gas, this aging population, or just the climate and other intangibles that go with it, the thought of beginning to incorporate communal transportation with our living makes a lot of sense. And speaking as somebody who probably stopped driving before most of you in this room, I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you.
When Amy called me, she really asked me to kind of throw some feedback into this mix about the social isolation that may occur, particularly with the elderly, due to inadequate transportation or other supportive services. And so I'm going to kind of deviate a bit just from the transportation discussion to talk a little bit outside just that strict parameter in terms of transportation as it exists today and, you know, a slight variation on that in the future. As usual, in looking out over the audience, I'm really singing to the choir, but I'm hoping that all of us, you know, can continue to be message bearers for, you know, these incredibly important messages that we talk about. And I'm privileged that so many people are, you know, really engaged in this conversation. I have been with the Fort Collins Senior Center for a period of time, and I've also been active as a staff liaison to the Senior Advisory Board for many, many years. One of the sole functions of each of those organizations is to be an advocate for needs for seniors. And in that light, we, as the Senior Center, as the Senior Advisory Board, and other agencies involved in senior work in the city of Fort Collins, came up with this concept of the community conversations around the silver tsunami, golden opportunity. Fort Collins is a great place to retire. How do we keep it that way? What are the things that we need to do? And really bringing all those things to the forefront, because it was our belief that many people were really not taking this whole event seriously. Even though in 1965, the United States passed the Older Americans Act and had set out certain principles, certain things that we should strive for to make sure that all people would age with dignity and with independence and with the support that they needed. And again, in 1991, the United Nations set forth 23 principles for successful aging worldwide. Among those, again, the belief that people as they age should be supported so that they could continue to live with dignity and with independence as they go through the aging process. And actually, the United Nations in 1999 labeled that year the year of older persons, in hopes that worldwide decision makers and governments would begin to look at this phenomenon of the incredible growth of the aging population. All those things had happened, and we felt that right here in Fort Collins that there was kind of this void, this lack of really looking at this and what this really means to our community. And so we had those 4 conversations. Now, Gary has touched on some of those statistics, and without going back through all that information, I do encourage you to go to fcgov.com and look at the Senior Advisory Board page. Most of the data from those events has been loaded there. And additionally, you know, that we can provide you with many reports that really address the significant growth in the senior population, what that might look like, what impact that might have, and some of the things that are going to be the most concerning. Just to summarize, if you go to the conclusions from those 4 conversations, and you also go to the CASEO report that was put out statewide, through the efforts of the Office on Aging, which is a wonderful resource for information about aging services and opportunities, indicated that if you were to rate all the various services that are necessary to support aging in your community, the thing that ranked the lowest was use public land, or how land was developed, and transportation services. That among all the things that they looked at and asked people about, those were the things that ranked the lowest. I think it goes back to one of the things that Gary was talking about also, in terms of when you look at standards across the nation, you're really looking at the idea of strong communities for aging in place and retaining that amount of independence really, addresses those communities where they are formed in neighborhoods, strong neighborhoods, where people have access to services and shopping and churches and all kinds of things in a very short amount of space. I worked for a very brief time in the Northeast, which was really different for a girl from Fort Collins, Colorado, let me tell you. But the older people would leave their homes in the morning, and they would walk to their churches, and they would stop at the market, and they would stop to meet with a friend, for a cup of coffee at a cafe. And they could do that all within blocks of their home. And this was a common way to stay engaged in their community, in their church, in their families, and it worked very successfully. Our way of life is very different. And somehow, some way, we are going to have to encourage the people who are making community plans for aging in place independently and with dignity and without having to rely on an abundance of services, that we somehow integrate back into our city plan that concept of neighborhood, where people don't have to call Saint or take a bus, to take care of some basic needs. And we could go on and on about, being able to access parks and trails and other kinds of services without having to go to great extents in order to do that. However, one of the things that Amy did ask me to talk a little bit about was this whole concept of social isolation. And with your permission, I'm going to move to the whiteboard. But one of the things that happened during our community conversation that really took hold with people was when we did a presentation on what we call the systems loss theory. And that occurred in, I believe, our 3rd conversation. But it really drove home the point that aging is not an abstract kind of thing. Everyone in this room is aging, and it's going to happen to all of us in some fashion. There are 3 things that ensure that we'll have long lives. Number 1 is luck. Secondly is heredity. And the 3rd thing is personality. Now, generally speaking, there aren't any services, resources, or classes that are going to teach you how to change any of those 3 or impact them significantly. So what we really have to focus on is really truly, how do we make the time that we're here really valuable, good for the individual, and good for the people around them? And so, back to old school, what we talk about is the system of age, or systems loss theory. And what it really boils down to is, whether we like to admit it or not, whether it's publicly acceptable or not, is that aging is loss. That's really what it's all about. And how we deal with that and how we cope with that translates into successful aging. And so we'll start out, and I'll try to be as fast as I can. But it starts out with the concept that a person is born and they develop a system, first of all, with their immediate family. They have parents, they have siblings. And as they move through life, they also have extended family, they go to school, and I should probably label these so I remember what they are. So they're friends and fellow students that you grow up with. And then you get a little bit older and you get involved in activities. Oh, like some of us, picked up a passion for art or camping or skiing or getting involved in do-good clubs or our church or something. But we begin to develop our passions and we meet people in that way. We go on to college. Eventually, most of us will marry, so you have a spouse. More extended family. The next thing you know, you have kids. Hopefully, depending on how you do it, you're going to get a job. You're going to have a profession. You're going to have a professional network. You're going to have all those relationships. And you move on, and you may join, some sort of civic organization. You're in a neighborhood, and you see how your life is growing. From the time you're born, you're constantly growing. Your social network is getting bigger. All these things are happening. But then at some point, things begin to change. Now, depending on your personal life, normally what happens is that you lose your parents. You may quit your job, which also means that you're no longer involved in your professional network and all those kinds of things. Sometimes, for many of us, the kids aren't next door. They're 2,000 miles away. Your college friends you see once a year, and that begins to be more problematic for many people, but you kind of stay in touch. You want to keep your passions, and you want to keep your old friends and stay in touch with your old neighborhood. But you're getting older. There may be a recession. There could be economic things. You or your spouse could become ill. The cost of health is incredible. People who are not dealing with someone who has a real health issue does not know what it costs in today's society to take care of someone who's ill. And so you begin to have, some of those issues. So the next thing you're going to do is you're going to move to a smaller house. You've lost your old neighborhood. You may be a long way from your church. Eventually, and this is usually the biggest thing that happens to people, is they lose their spouse. That's the huge support for, keeping that all intact. Then your well-meaning kids move you to Timbuktu, where all of a sudden, you're living close to them, but they're busy with their lives. They call you once a week or come by once a week. They may occasionally take you somewhere, but you have left everything that you've known your whole adult life, back here. So the idea is, in my mind, that the value of providing the kinds of services that we're talking about today is that these kinds of services should enable us as individuals, as people, to continue the humanity that we've always known. That ability to be able to connect socially, to go to church, to meet friends, to go to the theater, to do those things. And I think that transportation services should really start with the individual and not way up here with the organization. That our goal should be looking at, this could happen to any of us at any time, and believe me, life can change on a dime. But I think that the greatest visionaries in senior services have really started out with an outlandish vision to retain the humanity for all people and figure out how to get the job done. And that's what I would like to see.
Hi, I'm Marlo, and I am a circle leader in a community-based initiative aiming to deal with generational and situational poverty. It does so by building circles of friendships across economic class lines. Locally, Education and Life Training Center is the lead agency for this effort, and the Bohemian Foundation has generously given the startup funds. I'm going to tell you guys a little about me and my experiences and my situations so you can better understand. I have lived in Fort Collins, Colorado for 7 years. I am from New Orleans, Louisiana. I did come here due to Hurricane Katrina, and I am a single mother of 4 children. When we came, it was just an evacuation. By the time it was time to leave, I was set up in school, and with my oldest child, whom is severely disabled, was set up with tremendous medical care. I didn't see a need to root them and pull them back up and leave again, so we stayed. A little bit more about my son. He has cerebral palsy and he is deaf. He wears braces on his feet. He has a Baha, which is a kind of like a cochlear implant, and he has severe developmental delays and behavioral issues. Being a single mom and being here without a super strong support system and without having any family or any other friends or relatives is really hard, especially when it comes to transportation. Most of the time I've been fortunate to where I have made ends meet to where I can afford transportation, but things happen. I'm going to take you through a typical day in my life when I don't have transportation. It starts by waking up at 5 a.m., sometimes 4:30 a.m., depending on where we need to go and how early. Spend a little bit of time getting the kids up, feeding them, getting them dressed, most of the time bundled up because it's really cold here most of the years. And then we venture out. We try to leave the house by 6 a.m. because the buses start at 6:30. There's no bus stop near my house. We have to walk, I'm guesstimating about half a mile to a bus stop. We live on Mulberry, so we either have to walk. We live on Mulberry and Overland. So we either have to walk all the way to Taft Hill, depending on what bus we need. We have to walk all the way up to Taft Hill and Mulberry, or sometimes we can cut through the neighborhoods and walk to Elizabeth and Rocky. I don't know if you guys have ever caught in a bus, but you can imagine how that is at 6 a.m. with 4 children. It's not fun. We then get on the bus. I get the kids to school, daycare, where they need to go. And typically with my son's medical needs, the 6-7 appointments that I'm used to doing turns into 2 or 3 because that's all that I can fit in. I typically don't return home due to everything that needs to be done in town because of the way the bus routes are set up. There isn't enough time to get everywhere. So if there's a time gap in between picking the kids up or an appointment, I kind of hang out in town and try to either do some paperwork or I just kind of hang out. I then get the kids and we return to our journey home. We don't walk into our door until about 7 p.m. at night. With 4 kids, that leaves no TV time, no video games, no outside play. It leaves us to get home, hurry, do dinner, hurry, do homework, baths, and while it's necessary and we do what we have to do, try making 4 children understand why the typical day is like it is. I think some of the barriers for transportation is bus locations, definitely. I'll go into really quick about some of you may be wondering, because my son's disabled, about Dial-A-Ride. Dial-A-Ride is a great service, and I commend them for the help that they do. And they have approved my son for that. But then again, with being a single mom and no strong support system, I have 3 other children that have to go. And so a typical day using them twice for 1 trip there and 1 trip back costs me $15 a day. And I generally don't have that. That's not including all other appointments or any other necessities that we need. So I think bus locations are a huge deal. My son wears braces on his feet, and like I said, is deaf. So walking from my house to those bus stops, especially on Mulberry going towards Taft Hill, there's not sidewalk for all of it. And it's dangerous for my son. He's almost fallen into traffic twice because he doesn't listen for the car sounds. He's a 10-year-old kid. He sometimes gets clumsy. He trips, especially with his braces on and his new shoes. So it's kind of dangerous with 4 kids, having to watch all of them and then try to make sure that he is out of traffic's way. It's really hard to make those trips up and down the road. I think that locations for bus stops are one of the most important things that I would argue. Another thing that I heard someone else say was bus times. I definitely think that if we can find a way to restructure the routes and restructure bus times, it would help. It would time tremendously. I think it would help. Bus locations. Okay. Also, buses only run to certain parts of town. They run all in Fort Collins. I know that they added a new bus that goes all the way to Longmont and Denver, and I think transfers to Greeley. But there's no buses to Wellington. And I've heard from quite a few people that that's an issue. We have people that live in Wellington but have kids that either go to school here or have medical here, have a lot of ties to Fort Collins, but have no way once they're stranded, once their vehicle breaks or they're unable to drive. I think that's an issue that we need to, kind of look at too. I also think more education on how to understand the bus routes and how to get from here to there efficiently. I think that would help a lot of people because I get really confused. There's like 3 or 4 ways to go, but I don't understand what's going to save time and what's going to cause more time. So I think that is important also. Reliable, honest mechanics who will work with low-income people, not just through agencies, but will all low income who can prove the quality to get low rates on vehicle repairs. These deter people from taking their vehicles in and they know they do not have the money to pay for it. That was brought up by a friend of mine, and I do think that that's an awesome idea. I do think that if we can get a community together, whether it be through the city or whether it be through an organization that can get volunteers to maybe donate their time and we can, discuss low income car rates. Personally, I work with Huska's. Huska's does the work on my vehicle that I have now, and they're great, and they do a lot in the community. And I have talked to the manager, Jason, over there, and he has agreed for anyone that is in need of like a prepaid account, he will let you go and, whether it's $20 a month or $50 a month, you may not have car troubles now, but that's what I'm doing. So if you put this away and then something happens, I think it's a great resource for people with vehicles that just need the help. I want to thank you guys for taking the time to listen today and inviting me here to speak. These are some very important issues. Thank you.
Marlo, I appreciate that very much. It's really easy for us to focus in on the transit. That's where a lot of the conversations go out of necessity for this topic. But also talking about the importance of infrastructure. You listen to Mike or you listen to Marlo talk about when you have missing or inadequate sidewalk systems, access to transit, access to just basic things is every bit as important as where that bus comes, goes, leaves, those sorts of things. And then bringing in the whole notion of caring for an automobile and what those costs are. That's really, that really rounds out the conversation, so I thank you. The last panelist that we have tonight before we open it up for your conversation is Emma McArdle with Transport. We invited Emma because we wanted to have her talk about really some of the goals, what Transport and what the City of Fort Collins are trying to accomplish with their transit system, and then also the frustrations and the challenges that they face. We talk a lot about the frustrations and the challenges and the issues that the customers face as well. It can be every bit as frustrating for us when we want to provide a full service system, when we want to do the right things by the whole community, and how we at the same time balance that with realistic budget constraints, things of that nature as well.
So again, I'm Emma McArdle. I work for Transport. I do long-range planning and special projects for Transport. We've heard a lot about transit, and this has been a pretty emotional night. So bear with some of my data. I don't have the emotional points that these guys do, but I think a lot of it lends to what we've all talked about tonight. So just a little bit of data about Transport. We have 22 fixed routes. We have complimentary dial-a-ride service, and that's that black line around those lines up there. Our primary service hours are between 6:30 a.m. and 6:30 p.m., and our service is Monday through Saturday. We have a couple extended service hours. For 2 routes, we operate until 10 p.m., and then we have a late night operation primarily directed towards CSU students from 10:30 p.m. to 2:30 a.m. This is our ridership from 2012. As you can see, these 3 groups that are pulled out are youth, disabled, and senior. And those are typically population groups that can be considered to be transit dependent. So that's about 1/3 of our ridership. CSU students could also be considered transit dependent in some cases, so that would be 2/3 of our total ridership could be considered to be transit dependent. So what are some of the social impacts that transit can have on a community? There are many that we've talked about tonight, but some that I want to mention is it can reduce household expenses. I have some data, I'll back that up within a minute. It impacts mobility for all population groups across the community, low income, disabled community, youth, the growing senior population, and then also the choice rider as well. I'm not going to talk too much about this one, but I don't want to forget that it also has economic health benefits, and we've seen that along the Mason corridor, that we've seen properties redevelop along that corridor because ease of access into their businesses, and it will be there in 2014, so it's really exciting to see development starting around the transit system. So here I'm getting at, this is from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. Transportation is the second highest budget item for a family. So if you look at a transit pass versus paying for your vehicle expenses, there's a significant difference between owning and operating your own personal vehicle and riding transit. This next slide shows some example costs. I know it's becoming more and more common for people to drive SUVs, and look at that. Per year, owning and operating an SUV costs a family $11,000. That's a significant price to pay. And if you look at the cost of a transport pass, that's $152 for an annual pass. That's $25 for a senior or disabled annual pass. So there could be some significant cost savings to riding transit versus owning your own vehicle. So this slide gets at our low-income population, and you can see Fort Collins actually has a higher low-income population than the county or the state. So there's a lot of demand there. There's also populations living with a disability. 7% of our total population is living with a disability, and then almost 40% of seniors are living with a disability. So a lot of people that are transit dependent in our community. This gets at the senior and youth populations. In Larimer County, about 1/3 of the population is either senior or youth. We were expecting 140% growth in the senior population in the next 20 years. That's significant. So how can we as a transit provider provide for these populations better? What our goals are is to increase our service hours, increase frequency, increase area, increase days. What it really comes down to is convenience. We choose to own and operate our own vehicle because we want the flexibility and convenience of leaving whenever we want to, getting there as fast as we can. And when we've heard about these people trying to ride transit and it takes all day, of course you're going to take your own car if you have that option. But not everyone in our community has that option, so it's something we need to remember. So this is our service as approved for 2014. Again, this is our dial-a-ride boundary. Hopefully, if you have a disability or are transit dependent and need this service, you live in this boundary. Otherwise, you're out of luck. That's unfortunate, isn't it? Also, hopefully you only need to go places between 6:30 a.m. and 6:30 p.m. Does anyone leave their house after 6:30 p.m.? Yeah, see? People wouldn't be able to come to this meeting. So I just wanted to get this visual up here for everyone. Another point I'd like to make, the colors on the map show frequencies. So green is 10-minute frequencies, goes to purple, which is 30, and then red is 60-minute frequency. Most of our system operates on 60-minute frequency. That's another reason it's fairly inconvenient for most people. You don't want to miss a bus and then wait 60 minutes for the next one to come. We're also missing a lot of east-west connections. There's no service on Drake, Horsetooth, some gaps that we would like to fill, and those are Transport's goals over the next couple of years. So this is comparing that map we just looked at to our planned expansion. So Transport did a strategic plan in cooperation with COLT, which is City of Loveland's Transit, and Poudre School District in 2009. There's 3 phases to that plan. The one I'm showing on the left, or your right, is phase 3 of that plan. You can see that most routes operate at a 30-minute frequency on that map, as well as there's a lot more east-west connections, bringing people into that max route, which is the spine of our system. There's a lot more service throughout the city, and it's really our goal to get there at some point. Unfortunately, there's about a $15 million gap between what our service is today and this planned service. So it's not funded at this point. We hope that in the next several years we'll get closer and closer to this and be able to serve our community better. And there's also regional trends that I want to talk about a little bit. Our travel patterns don't end at the city limits. We're traveling to Loveland and Denver area. It's just not realistic to block those boundaries at the end of city limits. So we're really looking at this as a regional system, and that's why we've worked so closely with Loveland's system as well. Healthcare is a big one. We have a regional healthcare system that has, maybe you have a specialist doctor in Loveland, but your primary physician is here in Fort Collins. If you live in either community and you need to ride the bus or use paratransit to get to your physician, that's not available to you right now. So that's a challenge that Transport and COLT would like to address. These are from a survey that the North Front Range MPO did in 2009. And it's looking at travel patterns in our region. The one on the left is Fort Collins, and then on the right is Loveland. So in Fort Collins, it's saying that 83% of Fort Collins people that live in Fort Collins also work in Fort Collins. So their travel patterns stay in that in local Fort Collins. In Loveland, about 22% of Loveland work trips start in Loveland and go into Fort Collins. So there's a really strong interregional transportation pattern. It looked at shopping as well. You can see again Fort Collins has a strong local transportation pattern. Almost 90% of people stay in Fort Collins to shop. 14% of Loveland trips end in Fort Collins for shopping. And then here, healthcare. I've heard complaints about healthcare over and over again, and I'm sure a lot of you in this room have as well. You can see a very strong pattern on that 287 corridor coming from Loveland into Fort Collins, and vice versa as well. So all of these travel patterns and things we hear from the public is why we're looking at this as a regional system, and we're very fortunate that Transport and COLT system have really good staff that work together. We do the flex system in combination with each other, and you can see this is that strategic operating plan that we did in 2009 in combination with Colt. And it shows our systems working together. Each system did their own planning process and approval of the plan, just because system-wide it would be difficult to approve a plan when we're under two different agencies right now. But we do see them as working together, and you can see right now in this plan we have connections on I-25 as well as 287. This plan recommends a grid network. I heard one of the panelists say that they would like transfer it to get closer to a grid network, and that is our goal. This recommends extended service hours, extended frequencies, and regional trips for both fixed route and dial ride. So these are some exciting things that we would love to see happen. Another outcome of that strategic planning process was the North Front Range Transit Vision. And what that is a regional feasibility study for consolidation of transit operations. So what this was is our strategic plan recommended that the cities look at this, and in 2012 we began this study effort. So we've been going through this for about a year, done a lot of public outreach, and what the recommendation is coming down to is that we do pursue this consolidation effort for both fixed route and paratransit, and we start with Loveland and Fort Collins initially. And we use an intergovernmental agreement for the governance structure on that. The next steps is facilitating communications between the different agencies. So Fort Collins, Loveland, we're talking with Windsor, Wellington, we're talking with all of the different players in our region to see what interests are for consolidating transit operations. And a hope is that we would start with Loveland and Fort Collins, but potentially as other communities want service, that they would be able to join into this effort as well. So just to sum up everything I've talked about tonight, a robust transit system can have a serious impact on the social aspects of our community. It can redirect expenses from transportation to other household expenses, provide more mobility options for all people in our community. And Transferred is really doing our best to meet those needs as we work today, but we know that we have gaps in service, and we're trying to make strides to get better service for everyone in our community. So we're trying to improve hours, frequency, days of operation, service area, that's a big one, and but all of this is funding dependent. So even though everyone knows it's important, it's still a challenge because we compete against all other city funding offers when we do our budgets. So that wraps it up, and thank you.
Folks, could you do me a favor and just give the panel one more round of applause? I think they did a fantastic job tonight. There's some really good stuff tonight. And before we open it up for conversations too, Emma touched on it a little bit in the end. And the last budget cycle that we went through with the city was really transformational for me and really eye-opening. It's the first time in my years here where we literally had the community demanding additional transit service. And we're quite upset when we couldn't deliver that. We had put offers in our budget. That's how it works. We put the offers in, and then they're, as Emma said, they're considered along with all the other city needs, offers, funding availability, things of that nature. And we had looked for additional service on Sundays. One of the things we didn't talk about much tonight, I was hoping it would come up, but it didn't, was that when you don't have service on Sundays, not everybody works Monday through Friday 8 to 5. And so access to jobs is equally as important on weekends and in evenings as it is on a traditional Monday through Friday schedule. And that's something that for a lot of folks, myself included, it's very easy to let that slide and let that slip through. We also asked for additional service hours, additional routing, and it was very difficult. We got a lot of funds, more funds than we've ever received in the past for transport this year, especially with the advent of Madison Corridor coming on and the planning and the operations that are involved with that. That's going to be a critical component of what we're doing in the future, and we want to build off that. But still, to not be able to meet the demands and the needs that we know are out in the community is really hard from a staff perspective as well. I think what we'll do now is toss it out to the audience. Any comments, questions? This is doesn't look like too rough a bunch, but I will ask that let's be constructive with this. Let's be positive. Let's try and find solutions oriented to some of this, and let's just have that dialogue and move forward. And then at the end, if there's time willing, we're actually ahead of time. Yes. I have a capstone question I'll ask as well of the panel. So, any comments or questions from the audience this evening?
Hi, I'm Troy Jones. I'm on the Affordable Housing Board, and I am also an architect and a planner in the private sector here. And it occurs to me, particularly from the perspective of being on the Affordable Housing Board, that one of the things that, as we all try to figure out how to resolve some of the frustrations that a lot of the panel members have, and as well a lot of people served by affordable housing, is how do you mix the location of housing that the users of transit can afford to live in with a system that is frequent enough and it goes to enough locations. And part of it goes to what one of the things that Gary had said was you don't want to just have all of the seniors or all of the affordable housing just in one spot. You want a distribution to where you've got elderly and young people all in the same neighborhood. But at the same time, it seems that like the max is a wonderful thing, but one of the problems that from an affordable housing standpoint is the property values are pretty high the closer you get to that. And it seems like one of the challenges that we all face is to figure out a good happy medium to where we can get more seniors opportunities to live near the transit, more low-income people, more people with kids that may or may not have a car, the opportunities to be near Max and other, those side collector bus routes. So it doesn't take all day to use transit and also you'd want the doctor's offices and all the shopping and that sort of thing somewhere handy to that network. And I think it boils down to I think it was Barbara that said the city's going to be growing in the next 20 years, and I think Emma said something like 140% growth in the senior market, and so we got a challenge in front of us to figure out how do we locate all of the growth with people that need to ride transit somewhere strategically where they can use the transit that we have without having to create additional problems, but maybe we can, as far as putting them in locations where it's hard to serve.
One of the things that I heard you say was, I'm on the Affordable Housing Board, and that's become shorthand for lower income homes. I think that being a person who has always been mostly been in Fort Collins, affordable housing should mean that there are homes for people of a variety of incomes and needs within this community. And that we shouldn't always be striving to be exclusionary in terms of, always trying to have more costly homes and those kinds of things. We should purposely try to have developments mixed in, that there should be houses to meet the needs of people with a variety of incomes all over the place. And I hope that people will also look at transportation is not necessarily the city bus. Transportation is a variety of services that become available for people with different needs at different times, and provided in different ways, and could possibly be funded in a variety of ways. And Gary, I'm sure, knows more about this than I do, But when I first started at the senior center some decades ago, we had a nonprofit paratransit service in this community, or actually in the county. And that seniors and disabled people from all over the Front Range in Larimer County rode free to senior centers and meal sites and medical offices and jobs and all kinds of things. And that went away. I wasn't involved that much in that process. However, what I do know is that they actively solicited funding from a variety of sources, from the school district to Foothills Gateway to senior situations to city governments. They also actively recruited, monies from private charities and service organizations, and they had bus companies and car dealerships with their names on the back of their buses saying, this bus was paid for by somebody. And we had pretty good paratransit services that met a variety of needs, and it wasn't just limited to certain parts of the city and certain times of the day and for certain purposes. And I think that in order to solve these problems, we have to think outside the box. And limiting ourselves to just a few things, like anyone that's going to ride the city bus must be a low-income person and they're going to have to live in this part of town and blah, 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 is not going to deal with the big picture need.
Yeah, my name is Pat Jordan. I've been involved in transportation boards both in Boulder and Weld County and here. And there's one basic element that should only come into consideration for bus routes, runs, and whatever else. And it needs to be set up for the working man. It has to run for working man's hours. When you do that, then the rest will fall into place.
My name's Kevin O'Toole, and I was struck by something that Barb said when you were talking about your experience in the Northeast with the neighborhoods where the seniors were able to walk to church and to shopping, etc. How do you feel about trying to emulate that kind of growth in Fort Collins to reduce the need for transportation by having mixed-use development where the services are available within walking distance rather than having to depend upon a bus or a car or some other means?
Of course, I have a response for that. I feel very strongly that, the Transportation Board, just like the Senior Advisory Board, must realize that you have to stretch out and you have to go to the Housing Board and the Planning Board and all those places and say, this is not a one-dimensional situation. That when you build, when you plan growth, you have to look at many, many factors, and it may not just be the strict limitations that happen to be in the code book. And that transportation has to be part of that, and so many other things. And yes, I do believe that with encouragement, we can continue to try to encourage that neighborhood situation. In a way, we have gotten away from, the small little shopping centers in, housing areas, and we need to encourage more of that. And we need to encourage a lot of other activity, such as, the ability to walk more in our neighborhoods and in our community, period. And there's a lot of reasons why people don't do that. And that's all part of transportation, but it's all about saying it's not just transportation, it's not just seniors, it's not the disabled, it's not the poor. It's really that all of these groups and all of these things have to work together so that we really end up with a good product that works for all of us. And one of the things I think we have to be really careful of is because I moved to Windsor, and when you guys in Fort Collins, I'm acting like I wasn't really here, when Fort Collins passed city plan and they came up with these really strict guidelines, and a lot of people said, I don't like that, so I'm going to go someplace where I can have the kind of house that I want and I can kind of have the yard that I want and all those kinds of things. All of a sudden, what was originally a Fort Collins problem became a regional problem, where all of a sudden Fort Collins is really not that little drawing that I saw behind me. Fort Collins really stretches from Bellevue to Wellington to Timoth to Windsor and on and on and on. That's really Fort Collins anymore. And to try to approach these things within the confines of just our city limits is shortchanging all of us. And I'm actually a little older than Gary. I have a husband who has health problems, and I'm still working in Fort Collins. And one of my considerations is meeting all those medical appointments and stuff. And so I'm looking to move to Fort Collins, but the kinds of things I'm looking at are, where is the transportation? Where are the services? You know, where are all those safety nets so that we can continue to age in a good way? And if I end up alone, what does that mean to me? And what resources are there so that I can have a good life? So I think that all of us should be thinking that way, and we should be demanding that our community reflect those needs. And before I give up this mic, I've got to say, oh my God, I can't believe what you do to raise your kids.
So I have a lot of questions, but I'll just ask one right now. So Emma talked about the cost of owning and maintaining a car every month or on an annual basis versus a bus pass, which I think is incredibly compelling for anybody, not just somebody who's low income. That's a lot of money. And then I think about the seniors that Barbara, you and Gary mentioned, and also Mike, the colleagues that you have and represent on the the Commission on Disability. Did I get that right? Okay. So what I'm hearing are a lot of people in our community who either can't spend the money that they have because they can't get out of the house after 6:30 or whatever, or on Sundays, or people who are spending so much money on cars that they are strapped for other things, to be able to buy other things. And so I'm struck and I'm curious as to what you all think about the economic impact to the city if we were able to loosen some of those restrictions, get people out in town, going to restaurants and going to different activities. You know, would the city actually benefit from that, even though it may cost a little bit more money? I'm looking at the economic impact of that.
We really didn't plant the question, but it sure is a good one. And Mary and I both served on the financial advisory committee that worked on the regional transit plan that Emma talked about. Just to throw some numbers out to, I think, answer the question Mary raises, there's about 80,000 households here in Fort Collins. And if you said half of those households had a second car, and it's probably a lot higher than that, then that's 40,000. And if you were to say that of that 40,000, about half of those cars really exist just to get you to work, that you don't really need it other than the daily commute, that's 20,000. And then you were to say if you had a really first-class transit system, half of those cars could just simply not be there. You're down to 10,000 cars. Now let's take the cheapest car that Emma put up there at $6,000 a year. 10,000 times 6,000, that's $60 million a year that you just freed up in your community. Now to put that in perspective, you remember the 2B tax the past few years, Keep Fort Collins Great? That's putting $20 million into the economy. So if you could just provide a system that would get 1/4 of the second cars declared redundant, you free up a tremendous amount of community wealth. Now the transport system we have today is what, about $10 million, Emma? 8? Well, I'm counting Dollarite in there too, yeah? But I don't know. About 10. I think it's about 10. Okay, so we're spending $10 million a year for the service we've got. We have the potential to free up $60 million, and that's very conservative. I think it's a bigger number than that. So you could simply double your transport system, take that, figure out somehow to get that $60 million you've just freed up to help pay for it, and you've still got $50 million pumped into your purchases, your restaurants, and so on. Another phenomena that Emma didn't necessarily go into, of that $6,000 it takes you to keep the car, how much of that actually stays in your community? Okay, your mechanics, your dealers, the gas station operator, the insurance agent, but the vast majority of that money leaves. It goes to car manufacturers somewhere else, it goes to insurance companies somewhere else, and very little of it actually stays in our community to bounce around from pillar to post. Whereas if you have $50 million you now are spending in the community, it will bounce around anywhere from 4 to 7 times. So there's a tremendous economic benefit out there for all of us if we can find a way to connect transit with people's needs so that indeed they can step out of the cars.
I'm Bjorn Swenson. My general comment is more of a general comment, but I'd like to mention two different cities with different service results. First one I'd like to mention is Boulder, and what Boulder did in 1990 is their government and RTD proposed another plan, more of the same 30-minute bus routes and that was deemed unacceptable by the community as at large. So in 1994, Boulder came back with 2 routes, the hop and the skip, both at 10-minute frequencies. And in 2000, they improved it more, adding even more of the action verb named bus routes. Today, Boulder has a 400% ridership increase from 1990. The other city I'd like to mention is Ames, Iowa. Now, what does Ames know about public transportation? That's kind of but Ames started SciRide in the 70s. And today, despite having a third of our population, they have 3 times the ridership. How can we move Fort Collins? And I'd like to mention the Fort Collins approach with the Mason corridor. According to my conversation with Transport, it will only be about 30 to 40% ridership increase. How can we move Fort Collins from a 30-40% ridership increase to the numbers more by Boulder, Colorado, and by Ames, Iowa? It's not necessarily a question just for Emma up here. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it's more for a question as to the room and the people watching it as a whole. How can we move Fort Collins from being to being better than Boulder?
Great question. I think that comes down to my slide about convenience and flexibility. We choose to ride in our single occupancy vehicles because it's the easiest, it's the fastest, takes us exactly where we want to go. Our transit system needs to compete with that. That's the only way we get people to ride it, is if we make it competitive to driving your own vehicle somewhere. So that's how we need to get there. That's the best answer I have for that. And that's what Boulder has obviously done. They've made it almost as fast to ride the bus as they have to drive. So we need to get closer to that.
I think that's a really great question. And I mean, obviously the city of Fort Collins has that additional $15 million. And it's just that we're spending it on other things. And so I think, and I'm so appreciative of all of you folks coming here and talking to us about the concerns that you see in the transportation realm, because I think given the silver tsunami and given the growth that we're looking at in our population, whether we build out towards Windsor or whether we build up, like the buildings around us here in downtown, we're still going to have more population. They're going to need transportation, all of that. So I guess as a transportation board, I think it's going to be important for us to be thinking about how do we talk to council about what our spending priorities are in our community, because we're obviously going to need additional transportation in the coming years. And how do we move from where we are to where we need to be?
Emma, this is part comment, part question, but I remember a couple years ago hearing a presentation on Channel 14 from a group from northern Utah, and I think it was a group of private and public organizations that worked together to redevelop that area, to work on long-term plans for redevelopment. And what they did in order to educate people, I mean, you've mentioned a couple of times now that the competition between transport and driving a car is a matter of convenience, but that's in the current status quo. What this group did was they modeled what was going to happen to that region with predicted growth. And I think that we need to challenge people's underlying assumptions that the convenience of driving a car right now may not be there with predicted growth in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And at that point, the transit may be the more favorable choice, but we have to plan for that now. We can't wait till then. So, I mean, how do you feel about that?
I would say that's how we are planning right now. Our strategic, strategic city plan is looking at that. We look at the whole land uses, we look at transportation, and we're not trying to build our streets out as big as they can go. We're trying to keep them about where they are at and grow up versus growing out. And our transit plan is looking at that as well. We're trying to provide the best transit we can so we don't just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger out to our growth management area. So I would say those are the goals that we're trying to do. We do use modeling when we do all of our planning efforts to look at those things. Maybe we're not making it visible enough to the public, but we are doing those things. And Mark might have additions to that.
It really is. It's the long-term view in terms of what we want the community to be, where our long-term community values are. And I think you are seeing a shift, what we had talked about earlier, where the conversation as recently as 3 budget cycles ago is we really don't need to fund transit. We've got a lot of these other more important things to fund. And now the conversation isn't coming necessarily from staff, it's coming from the community. And I think that's where it has real power in terms of, we want better, we want more transit service, we want more accessibility for jobs, work, education, healthcare, you name it, quality of life. And that's a whole different dialogue, and I think that's what we strive to be as a community in terms of the future building plans, in terms of going to a more compact, more clustered land use pattern that you see in the city plan. I think that was what Barbara was getting at and what Mike was getting at in terms of, and Marlo as well, in terms of having that access within reasonable walking distance or access so that you aren't reliant upon necessarily a transit system, that you do have real opportunities and access to quality of life, shopping, what you need within close proximity. So, but it is a community dialogue. I think you've morphed into kind of my capstone question, and I'm going to take back what I said earlier. I said I was going to ask the panel to respond to it. I'm going to challenge the whole room because this is a sharp room. I guess, Barbara, I think it was Barbara that said earlier that in some ways we're preaching to the choir tonight in terms of, oh boy, we have these issues, we really should do something. So I guess my challenge to you is, what should we do? How do we effectuate that change? How do we effect change within the community? Mary started talking about the public dialogue with community leaders. What does that dialogue look like? How do we start taking this from within this circle and the people who live it and experience it to actually make some change in the community? So that's my capstone question.
I don't know if this is going to be completely effective or if this really answers your question, but it's just some ideas that I've thought about. First, to reconstruction, the routes and the pickup times and locations, we're looking at funding, right? Funding is the key thing. Well, why not get the community involved? Like certain businesses do with employees, they do incentives or discounts for employees that ride their bike. Why not the same thing for people taking the initiative to take the bus? Why not try to work with certain businesses or agencies to where if someone is taking a bus, maybe they can get a discounted rate somewhere, maybe at that establishment that they're going to. What about first come priority for appointments for people taking the bus versus people driving in? I think that those are some of the key things, because if we're getting people to take the bus more, it's obviously raising more money. What about a day where we advertise, a local bus riding day? We get the upper and the middle class community involved and challenge them, ask them to walk a day in our shoes, leave their vehicles parked somewhere at home and give their time and their money and take the bus all day and help out the community and also learn and experience what some of us do experience every day. I think that would, it might not give us all the funding we need, but I think it's a start.
Can I add to that a little bit? I've thought about the same thing, that bicycling has become such, the cool thing to do in Fort Collins. Everybody rides their bike, and somehow we need to make riding transit cool. How do we do that? I keep telling Kurt, my boss, we need to make transit cool. and I'm not sure how to get there, but beer on the buses, that would do. Well, if others have ideas, maybe besides alcoholic beverages on the bus, but
I think one of the things, after having had these discussions for many, many years in the senior rider, I think that in reality you should focus on younger people and really, begin to change those habits in, youth and young adulthood. I think the challenge of dealing with people who are older is very, very different and probably not going to be incredibly successful. What will occur if there is not reasonable, accessible, comfortable, safe transportation, the very elderly will become what we call the isolated elderly and will become homebound and will then be reliant on many, many services. But then again, realistically, for those of us who have lived in a place like Fort Collins all of our lives, where bus service was not really a transportation option for most of us, it's not a habit that we have developed. It's not something we feel incredibly comfortable with. And when the senior center went from Remington Street to the location that it is now out on Shields, almost all our downtown participation from seniors stopped. And there were two reasons. First of all, it took well over an hour to get there. And secondly, there was that discomfort at the changeover on the CSU campus. That for some it was okay, but for many, many others it was sometimes okay and sometimes not so okay. So we have some really huge issues in terms of, dealing with that ridership for older people and changing those behaviors. I think that in order to really move this process along in a realistic fashion, you're going to have to focus on younger people, and you're going to have to convince the providers that there are going to be a lot of older people. They're not going to really be open to riding the bus. As I say, when my car breaks down, I don't jump on the bus. There isn't a bus for me, but I don't jump on the bus. I call and say, I'm going to be late till I can find someone to bring me to work, or I stay home that day. Or you look at someone who's 80 or 90 years old, who doesn't have a car, it's snowing outside, and we expect them to walk a half a mile to the bus stop, jump on the bus, go to the grocery store, run their errands, go play bridge with their friends, and then go home. When people half their age won't do that. It's just not realistic. And so I think put your efforts where it's really going to pay off and do something else in terms of paratransit services for others.
I think the Mason Corridor, or the MAX bus system, is going to be a game changer. I think it's going to create a vision in people's minds that isn't there today, that, transit can be sexy and fun and fast and convenient. And I think that'll begin to inspire more creative thinking and more community support. I've seen it happen. I worked for DuPont, a big chemical company, in Wilmington, Delaware for a number of years. Downtown Wilmington is congested. You had to pay to park, like this was 10, 12 years ago, $150 a month to park. And as a result, executives from vice president level down rode the bus to come to work. In fact, during unusual times like pending layoffs, everybody got on the bus because you might accidentally overhear something. It did not have the social stigma. It was a perfectly acceptable thing to do, and people did it. So I think once we have the MAX corridor running, I just whispered in Barbara's ear, when you look at Emma's chart of the flow of people from Loveland into Fort Collins, they're likely to overwhelm that system day one. There's that many people flowing north coming to CSU who are going to say, hey, I can park for free and ride up, and for $157 a year, I'll do it. So I think we're going to see a lot of use, and I think it'll change the way collectively as a community we think about it.
I think Mason obviously offers that opportunity for the concentrated service delivery that was alluded to earlier, that's shown success in a community similar to ours in values with Boulder, and that's important, and I think Mason offers that opportunity. However, the caveat to that is that ultimately we have a long-term community vision, as has been alluded here a couple times, that seeks out and in many ways tries to codify higher levels of density. We right now are going through what I would say is a transitionary phase. We've finally become a metropolitan area in my mind. We've been there numbers-wise, and folks have told us for years we're a metropolitan area, but in reality now, we're seeing a transition within our community to more of a metropolitan lifestyle, with just the in-migration of folks from larger communities who have in their backgrounds, transit as an option, and it's what they did. But the matter of fact is that we are coming up against community decision after community decision on a micro level where we are undermining and undercutting that larger scale vision. And it's a time where we're focused on the impacts of this transitionary phase, and rather than trying to mitigate those in the midterm, we're eliminating them from happening because of the impact that it's going to cause. An example would be, and one that's just arisen of recent, is we have a transit overlay district, again, mimicking our corridor, correct? One of the items that have come through in a student housing action plan, in an instance where many folks are having issues with high density uses by students in their neighborhoods, again, concentrated around a large economic area in proximity to what is our future transit corridor, they don't like these. So we're adding additional parking standards and we're doing all these things. We're now seeking to impose those on the transit-oriented district, which of course, for those that understand it, is a layover that is to discourage the use of vehicles. It is exactly what it says, to encourage transit-oriented development. And now we're actually doing the opposite through our policies because of what the impacts are now. And so it's going to take a commitment through this transitionary phase to get us to the levels of density that ultimately is going to be needed, especially along our Mason corridor. And so for me, I have that great concern that while we have proponents and we have folks that sit through city plans that say we have this vision, we lack the commitment towards it right now. I would add then finally that we have to have a willingness to pay for that as well. And the number shows the amount of money that certain people are paying throughout the year. And I don't see that necessarily as that incentive to say, oh, it's so much cheaper to come and ride. It is, this is what our value proposition is, and we should seek to set our value there more readily. And as you alluded to with the younger population, I think it's very difficult. And while it's wonderful that the Bohemian Foundation does what they do to offset the costs of transit for students, what young people are being told is it costs a quarter. That's the cost of what this is, and that's the cost of, that's the service delivery that we're getting. We're getting our quarter's worth. And at some point, if we are going to transition, we've got to emphasize that there's a higher value proposition to these items. And maybe that opportunity along the Mason corridor is there, but I don't see us getting there unless we stay committed to that long-term version of who we want to be as a community.
Barbara's going to be amazed that I disagree with her. I'm on the Senior Advisory Board. And, you know, as far as how we make transit sexy, many of us do come from places where we're used to taking transit. You know, I lived for Dallas for 25 years and took the bus downtown every day for years and years. I don't do it here because I live on the far west and the bus routes just aren't convenient. But part of what we need to do in order to fund this thing so that you can get the higher time frames is to get people who don't classically ride the bus to pay for it. And I think part of the way you do that is, for instance, I hate driving down to Old Town with my car. It's just terrible. There's lots of traffic down there. So now that we've got the max route, find me a parking lot where I can park out at Drake and I can ride down to Lincoln Center and go down to the theater at Lincoln Center. You know, find me a parking lot at Drake where I can ride down and go to dinner or go to the Museum of Discovery and leave my car not exactly at my house, but out close to my house. And all of this will, you know, get me and other middle-class people who don't currently ride the bus, and we're never going to ride the bus full-time every day for our jobs, but we will ride the bus and use the transportation system some and become interested in financing it so that we can have more. So I really think that that's how you get the current non-ridership to be interested in paying for a more complete system, is to give us options like that where we can easily leave our cars, you know, out a little further and ride into the more congested areas to do stuff we want to do, but where it's a pain to currently take our car.
I'll make another comment, but it comes down to really three things that matter transit ridership. Those being service, service, service. I know I stole a real estate quote, but distractions it seems like distractions like what color the bus is, if it's in a fancy wrap. And that ultimately comes down to, is the bus available for me at a time convenient for me, that takes me to where I want to go in a reasonable manner, and at reasonable services. And another thing that it needs to be especially pointed out is the general comparison between American and Canadian transit agencies. Canadian transit agencies are more willing to accept higher fares, but in exchange you get better service. And a more extreme example, the York Region Transit, which covers the suburbs north of Toronto, their base fare is $3.75. While I'm not proposing $3.75 fares, their services are far higher. I like to use the generalized example of someone who gets off work at 11 p.m. Currently, transport shuts down at 6:30 p.m., which means that he has to shell out money for a taxi ride or borrow a ride from his friends or find some other way to get home, like maybe walking a couple miles. In Canada, while it might be $3 a ride, and while that might seem higher, there's a bus running until midnight, 1 a.m., or even in some cases, 24 hours. He is able to get home back at a convenient way, in a way that benefits him. And I think that there definitely needs to be some interest in what fare levels and how do we fund this and help raise fare box recovery ratios so that we do have money to fund service later at night or additional routes or additional frequency.
Let's go ahead and wrap up. Again, thank you, audience, and thank you, panelists. Appreciate this very much. Gary, did you want to say anything on there?
This concludes the Transportation Board meeting for February. Thank you very much for coming. And again, if you have interest or you want to get in touch with us, you know where we meet. Thank you.